everyone, and welcome back to Tea Time Thoughts. I'm Kaylin, as always, and today, while every lawnmower in the neighborhood goes off in the background, hopefully you can't hear it, I'm going to tell you about the incredible story behind the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer by Gustav Klimt. So, about a year ago today, I was in New York City with my friends Whitney and Juliana, and it was a really rainy day. We had just come out of Central Park, and I had actually just broken my purple umbrella, so we were a bit soaked, and we were trying to find the Niue Gallery, and at first I had pulled up the directions incorrectly on my phone, so we had to turn back around while we pulled up the hoods of our rain jacket, and so eventually we did find it, and it was smaller than I had expected it to be, but the entrance was somewhat off to the side, and so we walked in, and the lobby itself was just very nice looking, and it was the first Friday of the month, so they offered free admission on that day, so we were able to go in, and everyone there was very polite. They offered to check our coats, and they gave us plastic bags to put our damp umbrellas in. And so finally, after we got everything put away, we took a walk upstairs, and we walked into the middle of the art gallery, and there on the wall was the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, just absolutely encompassed in gold with flecks of silver and red and green, and I sat on a small cushioned bench facing it, and I think I just sat there for about 10 minutes or so because the story behind this painting has always fascinated me, and it almost seemed like something of a legend that just couldn't be real, but just standing there in front of me, there she was, and it was honestly one of the coolest things I've ever experienced. And I just want to say this as a preface for the story so you can kind of understand how I felt in that moment. So I'm going to start by taking you guys back into the Belle Epoque. So the Belle Epoque era was from about 1890 to 1910, and at the time the world was experiencing this overall optimism. It was the ending of an old century and the beginning of a new one, and there were a great deal of technological advancements and scientific discoveries. There were a lot of people experiencing economic prosperity. There were a lot of countries experiencing economic prosperity, and particularly in Europe, this period was a time of growth and experimentation, and within the Belle Epoque period, we also see the rise of the Art Nouveau movement. And Art Nouveau means new art in French, and it was a style that aspired to break from the traditional art styles of the 19th century and create something that was unique and perhaps more abstract and asymmetrical. And it's during this time that we start to see some of the artists that would make a huge mark on the new century. And one of the most prominent artists of this period was Gustav Klimt. So Klimt was an Austrian-born artist who originally started off as more of a conventional artist, and I feel like we see this with a lot of artists. They kind of learn all the techniques and stuff before they are comfortable enough to break the mold and develop their own style. So Klimt actually specialized in architectural decoration and mural paintings, but during the latter part of the 1890s, he began to develop more of his trademark style with very decorative patterns and linear drawing styles and two-dimensional figures. And in the midst of this, he founded the Vienna Secession, which was a group of artists that revolted against more of the traditional art form and progress of the Art Nouveau style. And Klimt actually received a lot of backlash for his works being too inappropriate or unrealistic or pessimistic. So in addition to working on some of his trademark pieces of art that we know, like the kiss and the embrace, he had to turn to more private patronization in order to forward his career. But thankfully, he was able to find a lot of success like this. So he began to do commissioned works for wealthy patrons in his home city of Vienna, Austria. And one included Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer, who commissioned Klimt to make a portrait of his wife, Adele. So in 1903, Klimt started to work on this portrait, but he also spent a great deal of time preparing for this. He drew over 100 sketches of Adele in preparation for this, and he also spent time studying a lot of Byzantine mosaics in search of inspiration. If you look at some Justinian mosaics, you'll get to see a bit of the inspiration that Klimt has for this portrait of Adele. And what's important too is in this period, Klimt was also in the midst of what's known as his gold period, in which he decorates the paintings with gold leaf. And this might seem a bit extra, but it was actually something common during the Art Nouveau period to experiment with some new mediums. People would try using glass, ceramics, and things like that, and seeing how they could incorporate that into the art. So not only is Klimt doing something that's fitting for the period, but he's doing something that establishes one of his own trademarks as something that's just undeniably Klimt. This painting would take about 4 years to finish, and it would be finally finished in 1907. And what's really interesting about the painting is that there are these very subtle A's and B's across the canvas that indicate Adele's initials. But there are also these eyes in the dress that almost look like these Egyptian sort of eyes of Ra, and there are different sorts of ovals and squares that reflect this Byzantine influence that Klimt gathered from his studies of the mosaics. And ultimately, all of these aspects work together and they create something of a timeless, above-human woman with a goddess-like beauty and something of a very all-knowing sort of melancholy expression. People have compared her to the Mona Lisa in trying to figure out what it is that's on her mind, and they also referred to her as the Mona Lisa of Austria because Klimt is this great Austrian artist and Adele is this beautiful, wealthy Austrian socialite woman. It's just sort of the epitome of beauty that Austria should encompass. But this is only the beginning. So Adele actually inspired other works of Klimt as well, and she was actually painted by him again in 1912 after his gold period when he portrayed her in a bit more of like a natural, floral type of setting. It's another one of my favorite paintings. I think it's absolutely beautiful. And Adele and her husband Ferdinand also purchased 4 landscape paintings by Klimt to add to the family's extensive art collection of over 400 paintings. And this was something that was very precious to the family. They'd spent a lot of time garnering a lot of great artwork, and they also spent a lot of time interacting with artists and great thinkers of the time period. That was actually how Adele had come to meet Klimt and develop a friendship with him. They were people that were very forward-looking and were very interested in innovations across all sorts of different aspects of life. However, in 1918, Klimt would soon pass away due to complications from the Spanish flu epidemic, and Adele herself would also pass away in 1925 due to meningitis. And as one of her last wishes, she asked for her husband to donate the Klimt paintings to the Austrian gallery after his death. Now, remember this detail because it's going to be very important later on. So going forward over the next decade, we see the Nazis rising to power, and Hitler had garnered a lot of fame while yelling into the microphone and passionately spewing sweat and spit in front of roaring crowds. And previously, the Nazi Party had difficulty gaining traction in Austria, but as they began to spread more propaganda aimed towards uniting German-speaking territories, it was reported that by 1932, over 80% of Austrians would be in favor of this unification. However, the same person who reported this statistic also reported that in 1933, 60% of Austrians were against it. So you can tell there's clearly some division and inaccuracies in the portrayal of this. So the Austrian Nazi Party, in order to push for this unification, they began to implement various terrorist attacks against Austrian governmental institutions and facilities because nothing makes people agree with you more than the threat of death. So eventually, Germany had worn down Austria's defenses, and in 1938, the Anschluss occurred, meaning that Austria had been annexed into Germany in part of Hitler's effort to unite the Germanic nations into what he called a Greater Germany. So come March of 1938, German troops began to march through the streets of Vienna, and they were greeted by crowds of hundreds of thousands of people who were cheering and waving flags or throwing roses down into the streets, but there are also a lot of people, including the Bloch-Bauer family, that saw this day not as one of celebration, but of very deep, sinking despair. Immediately upon arrival, the Nazis worked on anti-Jewish campaigns. Homes and shops of Jewish men and women were trashed and robbed. All of the synagogues were destroyed. Jewish citizens were blocked from jobs and universities. The Nuremberg laws were enforced, and they virtually stripped Jews of all of their rights. And the infamous Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass, happened in November of this year as well, during November 9th to November 10th. During this night, thousands of Jewish people were arrested and sent away to concentration camps. And of the 65,000 Jewish citizens living in Vienna that were sent to the camps, less than 2,000 survived. Those who were attempting to immigrate to escape had to leave everything behind that they had, and some of them even had to pay a tax to flee Nazi Germany. Others made arrangements to escape despite the dangers and the very high risk of being caught or ratted out to the Nazis. And among these escapees were Frederick or Fritz Altmann and his wife, Maria Altmann, Adele Bloch-Bauer's niece. Maria had married her husband Fritz in 1937, but shortly after the Anschluss, Fritz was arrested by the Nazis and held hostage in the Dachau concentration camp in part of an effort to force his brother Bernhard to give up his successful textile business in Germany. And after Fritz was finally released, Maria and Fritz eventually fled Austria in order to find safety. And on a very harrowing journey throughout Western Europe, crawling through grass in the night, hiding, flashing lights, climbing fences, and getting cut by barbed wire, Maria and her husband Fritz finally were able to escape to the United States. And in order to make this escape, they had to leave behind all of their possessions as well as their friends and family, many of which ended up later being killed by the Nazis or had committed suicide to escape their persecution. Maria's father, who actually owned a prized Stradivarius cello, had that taken away from him when the Gestapo raided their home. And 2 weeks after the raid, her father died, and Maria would go on to say with absolute certainty that her father died due to a broken heart. So, having to start this new life over in the United States, they went on to first find a home in Massachusetts, but then they decided to settle in California. And Fritz's brother Bernard, who was the owner of this textile company, sent Maria a cashmere sweater and attached a note that said, "See what you can do with this." And Maria eventually went on to attract a lot of buyers that were interested in the quality of the sweater and therefore would want to make business arrangements with the textile mill that Bernard would eventually establish in Texas. And she would become something of the face of cashmere in the United States. And she even went on to start her own clothing business. And Maria and Fritz went on to have 4 children, and they would spend a long and happy life together until his death in 1994. But 4 years later, in 1998, part of Maria's past would come back to life. In the 1990s, Austria faced a great deal of pressure to acknowledge its past affiliation with the Nazi Party, and in 1998, the Austrian Green Party worked on passing a new law concerning the restitution of artwork that had been looted by the Nazis. An Austrian journalist named Hubertus Czernin was finally allowed to look into the archives in the Ministry of Culture, and he discovered something very interesting, and this is where Maria comes back into the story. Maria Altmann's uncle, Ferdinand, had fled Germany as all the conflict began to arise. He had to leave behind his vast artwork collection, which was then eventually picked over by the Nazis, including the famous portrait of Adele. And the belongings in the family were stolen by some prominent members of the Nazi Party, including Göring, who stole the diamond choker that Adele wore in her golden portrait. And this choker was actually given to Maria as a wedding present, but Maria said that once the Gestapo had come through the door, they demanded her that she take off all her jewelry, and she never got to see the necklace again. Göring actually gave that necklace as a gift to his wife, who would wear it to very exclusive parties at which a lot of prominent Nazis were usually in attendance. Even Adolf Hitler had even taken some of the paintings to furnish his country estate. However, when it came to Adele's portrait, Hitler was something of a traditionalist when it came to art. He didn't like things that were more abstract or too modernist. So for him and a lot of other members of the Nazi Party, it didn't draw as much interest. But eventually, it was noticed by somebody more prominent in the party named Grimschitz, who, after holding on to this portrait for a while, eventually sold it to the Belvedere Gallery in Austria. So in 1945, when the Allied powers were able to declare victory over the Axis powers, they found that when it came to art restitution, it was really difficult to find the owners of the paintings. Many of them had been killed, many of them had fled, and the ownership was very difficult to deal with because other people had purchased or sold or traded the paintings elsewhere. If we look specifically at the Bloch-Bauer family's art collection, Ferdinand died in 1945, so if we look at Adele's wish to have the paintings donated to the Belvedere Gallery, then they were already in the right place that they needed to be. However, the ownership issues were still very murky. So Adele, even though she originally wanted to give the paintings to the gallery, she wasn't technically the owner of the paintings, so she didn't have the authority to give them away. Her husband Ferdinand had paid for them, and therefore he had the right to determine where they would go, because Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer had not donated the paintings to the Austrian Belvedere Gallery. He wrote in his will that he wanted his possessions to go to his nephew and his 2 nieces, which included Maria. And we immediately think, well, it belonged to the family. Obviously, they should give it back. This should be a no-brainer situation. But over the 68 years that this painting spends in the Belvedere Gallery, it becomes something of an icon throughout Austria. People can't imagine the country without this portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. And what's even more sad is when the painting was donated, in order to cover up Adele's Jewish heritage, they couldn't display her name and therefore show that this beautiful woman that they admired was a Jew. So they referred to the portrait as the Lady in Gold or the Woman in Gold. Not only are the Bloch-Bauers separated from their possessions, but the identity of Adele herself is being wiped away. So at this point, with the restitution laws being redrafted, Maria contacted a family friend who was a lawyer named Randall Schoenberg, or Randy Schoenberg, as I'll refer to him throughout this episode. One thing to note, too, is Randy was actually the grandson of the famous composer Arnold Schoenberg. And one of the reasons that he looked into this case is because this was something of a personal matter for him. Not only did his grandfather Arnold Schoenberg have to escape from the German territories during World War II, but his great-grandparents had died in the Holocaust, and he has this desire to help make things right, as any person would want to. So Maria and Randy filed a claim with the Restitution Committee regarding the 6 Klimt paintings that had originally been in possession of the Bloch-Bauers. Those are the 2 portraits of Adele and then 4 landscapes. But the committee ultimately denied the request, and they cited Adele's will in order to defend their decision. Basically, oh no, she wanted this to happen, so what right do you have to deny a dead woman's wish? But again, Adele didn't have the legal authority to make that claim. It was all in Ferdinand. So legally, the paintings belonged to Maria as per his last wishes. So the next step for Maria and Randy was to file a civil claim against the Austrian government within the country of Austria. But that would have been almost impossible for her to do. The cost to do that would have been nearly $2 million. And that was something that the Austrian government was aware of. They were wanting to put these roadblocks up so that way it would be difficult to gain the paintings back. It would have cost Maria everything that she owned to pursue this, so they thought this would be enough to deter her. But instead, she and Randy opted to sue the Austrian government and the Belvedere Gallery from within the United States. So the Austrian government decided to file for dismissal, and they pled exemption from having to go to court due to the Sovereign Immunities Act that was established in 1976. But Randy was ultimately able to point out 3 rules that the Austrian possessions of the paintings broke. The paintings had been taken by illegal means. They were stolen during World War II by the Nazis. They, in very loose terms, I guess you could say, owned paintings at this point. And they also were commercially profiting off of the paintings via merchandise, books, postcards, what have you. So they had the legal reasons they needed to take this case to court. So what followed next was a long and tedious 4-year legal battle. Part of the reason why this case was dragged on for so long was yet another roadblock by the Austrian government against Maria. They were hoping that she would die before the case was over, because by the time she was looking into the restitution laws and beginning to make her case, she was in her 80s, and if she were to die, then the case would be closed and everything would end as it was, and Austria would be able to keep the paintings. So among the arguments that they made, they said the paintings should remain in Austria because allowing the paintings to be returned would just open up a Pandora's box in the world of international relations. If paintings were returned to a Jewish family that had been wronged during World War II, then suddenly Japan might ask for reparations from the Americans for their presence in the country after the war. India is going to demand money from Britain. Countries in Africa will demand money from the European powers that have colonized there. Heck, Mexico might even ask Spain for compensation from when they sent Cortez on his merry way over. So their claim is basically the world will just fall apart. If you've seen the James Acaster bit on museums and imperialism, then you kind of get some of the issues with that. These people want the stuff that's been stolen from them, but because we've held on to them for so long, we kind of feel like finders keepers, losers weep. But thankfully, Randy was able to give a great performance in court. And he wasn't entirely sure about it when he was there. He did say that he was very nervous because obviously this is a big deal for a lawyer to be presenting a case in the Supreme Court. So when he was in the courtroom, he said that at one point one of the judges asked a question. He asked this very long and lengthy question and kind of just going on and adding like more adjectives and stuff to it. And then all of a sudden he just kind of stopped, and Randy stood there for a bit and tried to kind of figure out what was going on, but he just had no idea what he said. And so he just said, "Could you please rephrase the question? I'm afraid I didn't understand it." And as a lawyer, that's something that would be so embarrassing, I imagine, because it'll make you look weak in front of your opposition. But thankfully, some of the other judges sort of smiled or chuckled as if it was just something that one particular judge would do a lot. So that helped to kind of clear the air. And Randy, at the end of the case, said that he felt very good about the argument that they were able to pose. But one day he said he opened a legal newspaper that was based in LA and saw a headline that read, "Court likely to revert Altman case." And he was just absolutely shocked. He called the reporter that had written this article and asked how he could tell that they were going to lose with such certainty. And so the reporter said, "Listen, I have witnessed Supreme Court cases for over 35 years. You can just tell how the outcome is going to play out." And Randy was like, "What do you mean? How can you tell? Some of the judges weren't even speaking." And the guy said, "It's all in the body language. Even if they don't speak, I can tell, and you're going to lose." Obviously, that was a huge downer to have to listen to, and Randy became more anxious. Of course he would after hearing something like that, but 3 months later, Randy got a call that they had won the case. And of course, this was thrilling news, and it was a victory for Randy and for Maria, and in a way also for the Bloch-Bauer family and for Adele Bloch-Bauer. But winning this case basically meant that what they won was the opportunity to sue the Austrian government. But at this point, Maria was 89, and another long legal battle again could prove to be risky if she did die. And then, once again, if she did die, the case would end there, and the Austrian government would maintain the paintings, and it would hold on to that portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. So eventually, Randy was able to get them to agree to a litigation in Austria, which is interesting because the Austrian government was okay with this outcome when earlier in 1999, they completely shut down any chance of a litigation before. So the 3 arbitrators on the panel ultimately agreed completely to give the paintings back to Maria. And this was something that the country of Austria seemed to be very upset about. As we mentioned before, Klimt helps develop this identity of Austrian art, and these paintings in particular are icons of Austria, and this portrait of Adele is this representation of all the wonder and beauty that's in the country. So people were protesting to get the paintings to stay in Austria. People were suggesting that Mrs. Altman get to keep the Klimt landscape paintings and leave the portraits in Austria because you're taking away the face of Austrian art if you do this. But ultimately, legally and rightfully so, Maria owned and deserved to own the painting of her aunt. So eventually the paintings would make their way over. Austria did mourn with public posters of Adele in her golden dress and a large caption that read, "Ciao Adele." And finally Maria was able to take the paintings home in 2006. She later sold this famous golden portrait of Adele to Ronald Lauer, the son of Estee Lauder, for $135 million, which at the time that was the most that anyone had ever paid for a painting. A lot of people found this sort of interesting, like she just got these paintings back. Why doesn't she hang it up in her kitchen or something so she gets to look at her aunt every morning? But she said, "I would not want any private person to buy these paintings. It's very meaningful to me that they are seen by anybody who wants to see them because that would have been the wish of my aunt." And that does kind of make us think back to the wish that Adele had to donate those paintings to the Belvedere Gallery in the first place. And it makes us think back to her patronage of an artist like Klimt and her desire to interact with and learn from all these very studious and talented and artistically creative people. So, painting of Adele is now on display in the new gallery in New York, and it is still there today. And it is truly one of the most beautiful paintings I've ever seen, and a memory that I will definitely be holding on to. So as for our main characters here, Randy went on to specialize in art restitution cases in a law firm that he founded, and Maria donated a great deal of money to Los Angeles charities for Holocaust victims. And in a documentary I watched of her, when someone asked her how her life would change, because now she was a millionairess, she just sort of chuckled and said that nothing would change. She had bought herself a new kitchen set, but life would go on as it did before. Due to this victory and this stroke of justice that we've been able to see with Maria getting the portrait of her Aunt Adele back, Adele has been immortalized not only through Klimt's beautiful portrait, but through the fascinating story of the ownership battle. And that's what's so interesting about this, is we cling on to this story and we feel this comfort that yes, it's all restored and all is right again. But one thing that is really interesting, actually one of my favorite movies, is called The Woman in Gold, and it's based on this story. It's starring Helen Mirren and Ryan Reynolds. But when you watch this movie at the end, before the credits roll and it's telling you sort of what happened to each of the people in the story, there's a black screen with white text, and it says it's estimated over 100,000 works that were stolen by the Nazis have not been returned to their original owners. And it's something that shocks you immediately, because you see this wonderful story and you get the chance to feel like justice has been restored somehow, but at the same time, that's also not something that we lived through. And there's a scene where after they do win the paintings back, where Maria starts to cry and Randy goes over to comfort her, and she says it hasn't fixed anything. It hasn't brought her family back. It hasn't saved any of the friends that were killed or forced to kill themselves during this war. This part of the past shouldn't be overlooked. We need to be mindful about what the impacts of events like the Holocaust and World War II have on our modern day, and we need to recognize that it's really not as far off as we may think it is. There's this other part in the movie, makes me get kind of emotional every time, where Maria's saying goodbye to her parents before she leaves, and she knows she has to escape. And this was a bit fictionalized for the movie drama, but you can definitely feel some of the emotion that goes on there as Maria's saying goodbye to her parents and getting ready to leave, and knowing that she will probably never see them again as she walks out the door. Her father says, "We just ask one thing, and that is that you remember us." So that's it for this week. Thank you guys so much for listening. I'm sorry this episode came a bit later. I have been working on some applications and things with school. Some of my visa stuff's just been kind of tricky. The processing of my visa was actually delayed, so I don't know when I'll be heading off for grad school yet, but hopefully it'll come sometime soon, and I'll be able to share some of my experiences and fun stories with you guys off in merry old England. So if you liked this episode, or if you like the podcast and you enjoy listening to the discussions that we have, please follow, like, subscribe. Every platform is kind of different, so whatever your platform allows you to do is good. If you want to rate the podcast, please go to ratethispodcast.com/teatimethoughts. I would really appreciate it if you did so. It does help boost the podcast and help us reach other listeners that would be interested in joining in on our conversations. And again, if you're also interested, I started a Tea Time Thought Instagram, so that's at Tea Time Thoughts Podcast, and there's also a YouTube channel where I'm posting the episodes as well, so if that would perhaps be easier for you, or if you want to watch it without ads, because we're small enough right now that we don't have ads, so you can watch uninterrupted, go ahead and check that out. Again, if you have any ideas for future episodes, that would be great. And also another reminder that if you want to fact check something I said, or if something about that is off and you want to tell me, please do. I'm absolutely open to hearing adjustments or corrections that I can make. For instance, I was actually reading about the Romanov family this week, because when am I not? And a couple weeks ago in my episode about Charles II, I briefly mentioned Peter the Great, and I said that he was 6'6". Turns out Peter the Great is actually 6'8", so I just wanted to correct that and contribute even more to this very frightening image of Peter the Great, because homeboy was pretty scary, and I will do an episode on him sometime in the future. Don't forget to tune in next week when I talk about Cortez's arrival in Mexico and the revenge of Montezuma. Thank you guys very much for listening. This is Tea Time Thoughts. I'll talk to you next week.